Akazienzendo podcast.
Thank you for your generosity and your patience with me. As some of you know, I was in Morocco for 2.5 weeks, 10 days of which I spent with a group of wonderful people hiking in silence through the Sahara, through the desert, and practicing zazen and meditation. What can I say? It was a rich and wonderful experience. It was a challenging and frightening experience. At times, I felt like a 5-year-old being totally comfortable in the sand. Once or twice, I woke up at night looking at the Milky Way. There was no artificial light around. So there was the mystery above me. And I wasn't thinking, but I was aware of being in the presence of the light emanated by a star 100 million years ago, or a galaxy. And here I am, this insignificant being with a few seconds I have alive in this universe. And then I actually remembered Vasubandhu's teaching. Everything conceived as self or other occurs in the transformation of consciousness. That's maybe the Big Bang of the Mahayana, the Big Bang of Mahayana Buddhism. I could feel a little bit that the desert out there, this strange landscape for somebody who grew up in Central Europe, it's not really out there. The desert was, for my time being there, who I was. I became a desert being. I had desert sensations, and I had desert emotions, and I had desert thoughts. And suddenly, 2 days ago, by means of miraculous technology, I was back in Berlin. And now I'm a Berlin being again, with Berlin sensations, Berlin thoughts, and Berlin emotions. I just called it the Big Bang of the Mahayana. Vasubandhu says all that we refer to as self and as things, that which is other, are nothing but transformations of consciousness. This is a recap in a way, but it's also hopefully new and comes across alive. What we can understand through studying Vasubandhu is that we, human beings, cannot step out of consciousness. We cannot step out of consciousness, so to speak, and touch the world. Because once we touch the world, we are back in consciousness. And the world, in turn, touches us all the time. The way we humans experience the world is as consciousness. We do not experience the world, we experience consciousness. However, that's totally fine, because the consciousness Vasubandhu speaks of has the same limits as the phenomenal world. And as the phenomenal world has no limits, because it's unfathomable and deep and has no beginning and no end, also the consciousness that Vasubandhu speaks of has no limits, no beginning, and no end. It's not as we usually imagine it if we are not trained in meditation and in the Zen or Mahayana teachings. It's not that there's this limited, small consciousness somewhere hidden within our bodies, within our head. It is the other way around, that we, with our entire life, appear within consciousness. If we can see it, it's wonderful, liberating news. I also want to say, this is not a metaphysical teaching. Do not look for this consciousness as some kind of metaphysical entity. It is nothing but your experience right now. But your experience right now, I'm suggesting to you, is basically unlimited. But of course, at first or for a long time, we don't believe that. We also already talked about how Vasubandhu describes 3 aspects of consciousness. That's verse 2. He says, this transformation has 3 aspects: the ripening of karma, or ālaya consciousness, the consciousness of a self, and the imagery of sense objects, or sensory consciousness. I think in one of our meetings I called this a mind map. I don't think he's saying that these consciousnesses really exists as he describes them in this verse. It's just a skillful means for us to become exact and precise in our study of consciousness, which is the same as our study of ourself, or the same as our study of our immediate experience. He wants to help us to become intimate with the complexity of this very moment. But things can be said about these 3 aspects of consciousness. For example, tonight I want to say, if we study them, we get in touch with more and more subtle expressions of consciousness. What I mean is this, and I think it's very simple. Let's start with the last, sensory consciousness, which in this translation is called the imagery of sense objects. The phrasing is important here because already here he tries to point out, Vasubandhu, I translate him into my words, is saying, yeah, study sense consciousness. Study how we are being touched by sense objects and how experience arises. Visual, hearing, smell, taste, touch, and so on. But he also says, be careful. You're not being touched by real objects, because these real objects are already images. They are the imagery of sense objects. They are consciousness only. And yet, we talked about this many times, this is an important aspect of Zazen practice. to rest, to try to rest in sensory consciousness and to witness how we are constantly being touched, how our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, tongue, the entire body is being touched. It helps us to understand or to enter an experience of the richness of daily life. The second transformation, the consciousness of a self, that's much more subtle and in a way an interesting creative challenge for Buddhist practitioners. Tonight I would say it in this way again. We all have a sense of self. It's part of our conscious experience. It's in language. I'm thinking this, I'm doing that. And we unconsciously assume that there's an entity, that there's something we can call an I besides the word I. We think that there is a self within us that doesn't underlie the law of impermanence or the reality of constant change. Look into this. I'm not trying to talk you into it or trying to convince you, but I think if you look at your direct experience, you can find this. There's a direct sense of self as a reality. Now, the creativity of Vasubandhu is he doesn't deny that, but he says, please look, that's an aspect of your consciousness. So it's not that the self or the I is the bearer of consciousness, but there's a conditioning within consciousness that we call a self or an I. And we can wake up to this. We can wake up to this deep conditioning of believing in a separate self. Then the sense of being a separate self doesn't fall away. But basically we can see through it and start to see the interdependence of self and other, the dependent co-arising of self and other. And then there's the one he mentions first, in this translation, the ripening of karma, or ālaya vijñāna, ālaya consciousness. And he says it in verse 3. Ālaya, the store consciousness, contains all karmic seeds. And then he says, what it holds and its perception of location are unknown. I'm suggesting to you, ālaya doesn't exist. But there's a reality of, I think the way I put it in the past is, our life is so rich that everything we say, everything we think, and everything we do or act out isn't gone when it's over, but it leaves a trace in human consciousness. This trace is unknown, and we do not know where it is. What it holds and its perception of location are unknown. So that's why people call it a Buddhist version of unconsciousness. And depending on innumerable causes and conditions, these traces of past activity will ripen as a new moment of experience. once we can see it, study it, it means we can get a deep sense of, what's the word I'm looking for? Of the totally dynamic process that every single moment is. So these are certain aspects of ālaya. Ālaya is what it holds, the seeds it holds, the imprints of past activity that ālaya consists of, is at once subjective and at the same time it's collective. It's an ālaya that pertains to human beings. I like to say to Homo sapiens. So in terms of practice, I can only do this very briefly. Of course, we practice mindfulness of our emotions, of our thinking. And the richness of human life is that each person's emotional and intellectual response to whatever it is that's happening at this very moment is slightly different, or sometimes vastly different. Some people in the desert were overjoyed and felt held by the desert. Some people described their experience as it was frightening to be in what they perceived as an environment that was hostile to life. So same event, but subjectively very different experience. So that's part of our study, mindfulness study. And then Vasubandhu is also suggesting to us that there are deep conditionings in ālaya, in the human mind, that are completely, for a long time, unknown to us as conditionings. Or I could also put it like this. We perceive the world as being out there, consisting of beings and objects totally separate from us. I think that's an adequate description for most of our experience. And we think this is how the world is, and this is how our life is. And we don't see yet that the separateness is something that the Homo sapiens mind co-creates in correspondence with life as it is. But we can become aware of these deep conditionings that we all share, and becoming aware is synonymous with we can become liberated not from them, but within them. We can become liberated from the perception of being separate from the world within the perception of feeling separate from the world. I hope this point is clear. Now I will jump. Now I will go to what's much later in Vasubandhu's 30 verses, where he brings up something that in Buddhist culture of his time was a novelty. So I would say he was very creative. He invented something. It's an invention, of course, which is how can we actually study this separation? And how can we, as some teachers say, and I guess I'm channeling them right now because I'm saying the same thing, that we can look through this deep impression of separation. Well, it's in verse 20 and 21. in verse 20, he says, whatever thing is conceptualized, by whatever conceptualization is of an imaginary nature, it does not exist. I guess that needs some explanation, which I'm happy to try to give in a second. Verse 21, he says, the other dependent nature is a conceptualization arising from conditions. And then the complete realized nature is the other dependent natures always being devoid of the imaginary. If you feel bewildered now, if you hear this for the first time, I understand. Vasubandhu, maybe other people were involved. So let's say Vasubandhu, with other practitioners, came up with the following idea. Basically says, dear practitioners of the Mahayana, dear people who you want to wake up to the reality of the world for the well-being of all of life, it would be important to study that every moment of experience, or even more simply, that every person, animal, or object you see has three natures, three aspects. The first nature is the imagined nature. The second nature is called the other dependent nature. And the third nature is called the complete or realized nature. So I try to explain this now. The imagined nature, the first nature, has a deep connection to the sense of self, because there is, according to Vasubandhu and other Mahayana practitioners, it is our human mind that projects a self not only onto us, but also basically on everything we experience, on other human beings, on animals, on objects, on mountains, on airplanes, on deserts. This projection of self is unknown to us. It happens in a completely unconscious way. And yet, we can realize that. We project a self, or self also means, I hope this word speaks to you, an essence or a core onto trees, onto other human beings, on pieces of bread, on a slice of cheese, on everything. And because of that, we can perceive it as being separate, which gives us a lot of power, imagined power over things. So the sense of separation is deeply connected with projecting selves or essences onto others and onto ourselves. It's actually the condition for thinking and also emotionally feeling that something is other to us, a person or a culture, for example. That's the first nature. Second nature is simply called the other dependent nature. And that's core Buddhist teaching. It's a teaching, already the Buddha's teaching, of dependent co-arising, of interbeing, of interpermeation, which is basically a vision of life, which is everything gives birth to everything else from moment to moment. Self and other always arise together as one field of living experience. And it is only our projecting mind, projecting essences into this field that basically is able to dissect this field, to cut it up in separate entities. So in a way, we could say, I want to be cautious about this, because Vasubandhu doesn't like to talk about reality. But the second nature, the other dependent nature, dependent co-arising, that's a reality of life constantly unfolding as one inseparable field. And then there's a third nature. What do I want to call this? Well, here it's called the complete or realized nature. The complete or realized nature is basically an insight. It's an insight which Buddhist practitioners, or sometimes very gifted human beings, maybe artists, musicians, scientists, or any ordinary being, can have, which is, here he says, the complete realized nature is the other dependent natures always being devoid of the imaginary. I translate. The other dependent, I'm suggesting to you, is life as it is, unfolding based on myriad causes and conditions. Is you giving me life, the desert giving me life. I have no life separate from the desert. It's other dependent. However, there's the imagined nature of being separate. Desert is over there. You're over there on my screen. This is an imagination, or this is a construction of the human mind. And the liberating insight we can have through practice is, as he puts it, that the imagined nature is nowhere to be found in the other dependent nature. Or, as I suggested to you before, there's an imagination of having or being a separate self. That's the imagined nature in us. But if we study closely, we can see that within the other dependent nature that we are, this imagination doesn't exist other than as imagination. And that's the deep liberating insight. That's why it's the complete, realized nature. I try to say it again. We can realize that basically it is the making of the Homo sapiens mind to project otherness or separateness onto everything. And we can realize that the separateness is not contained in the thing as such. And this realization is complete. No other realization is necessary according to Zen or Mahayana Buddhism. This talk is getting long, and I think it covers a lot, but allow me to say one last thing. Question, of course, comes up, so how can we realize this? How can we realize the other dependent nature of all things? How can we realize the deeply connected field of existence, field of life? I can only say it like this. Before I traveled to Morocco, I saw a wonderful movie, Silent Friend. It's by a Hungarian director Ildiko Eleni. And it's a feature film. It's 3 interwoven stories about people in different times between the late 19th century and around 2020, time of the so-called pandemic. And also one story placed in the 1970s, who basically are scientists, and they go beyond their field and they do research into the consciousness and the communicative behavior of plants. And the film is based on findings by contemporary scientists in this field. And at the very beginning, we see a Chinese neuroscientist who tries to find out how the consciousness of babies, of little human beings, before speech, before they learn to speak, how consciousness functions. So I guess that's very tricky. And the way it's shown, that's fictionalized in the film, is quite wonderful, because we see little puppet theater. And then there's a close-up of an adult watching the puppet theater, and the adult's eyes, they jump, and also his face moves. So basically, the adult mind focuses on separate entities, tries to follow a storyline, thinks about it, and so on, and so on, and so on. I guess you get the picture. Then there was a close-up of a baby. And the baby was just shiny, with eyes wide open. And I was aware that the eyes didn't move, they didn't flicker. And then basically the scientist, that is the actor who played the scientist, later said, our understanding is that the human mind, I mean the grown-up mind, unconsciously cuts up reality into these entities that she or he or they can name. Oh, this is this character, and this is puppet theater, and so on. While he said, as far as we can understand, babies, before they learn to speak, their mind basically rests in a field. But he also said, and yet they are acutely aware of every detail of what is appearing in this field. And I did some research myself. Like I thought, well, maybe this is also fictional, but that's basically how neuroscientists today think about how human consciousness works before we learn to cut up the world through language. Now, I, as a Zen practitioner, thought that's fascinating, because Zen practice is not about becoming babies again. That would be a misunderstanding. But as a Zen practitioner, I would say we never lost this capacity to rest in the field of mind. We never lost it. But for some reason, because of the power of projection, of a mind that creates otherness through language and then believes in this otherness, in this cut up, fractured world, because of that power, we are usually not aware of the subtlety of resting in the field. So why do I bring this up? To say what I try to express tonight needs the practice. For most of us, it needs the practice of learning to rest in the field of mind or in open awareness. And then this field of mind, once our intimacy with the field deepens, which needs practice, this field will teach us what? Well, that we are always involved in constructing the world with the world. Self and other are always involved in constructing self and other. This is a concept, a projection of selves, of entities, which Vasubandhu calls it's the imagined nature that we project onto everything. We can learn to see through it and basically intuit the other dependent nature, which is the field that babies live in. And this is a deep, liberating realization. That's a realized nature. When we understand this imagination, we cannot stop it. It's created by the Homo sapiens mind capable of speaking very complex languages. Cannot stop this. But we can see that these concepts are not contained in the field that is constantly unfolding in utter abundance. Thank you for listening to this slightly too long talk. Thank you very much.
Das war eine Folge des Akazienzendo Podcast. Wenn du deine Praxis vertiefen möchtest, bietet Akazienzendo eine Vielzahl von Meditations- und Kursangeboten, die dich auf deinem Zen-Weg begleiten können. Informationen dazu findest du auf unserer Homepage. Wenn du unsere Arbeit und unsere Podcasts unterstützen möchtest, freuen wir uns über deine Spende. Den Link zur Spendenseite findest du in den Shownotes oder auf akazienzendo.de.